Good afternoon, everyone, and good morning or good evening for those coming from other time zones. Thank you for joining us. My name is Raquel Miguel. I'm a senior researcher at the EU DisinfoLab, and I will be moderating this new edition of the webinar series hosted by our organization. As you might know, we are a non-profit organization gathering knowledge and expertise on disinformation in Europe. And we regularly host webinars in order to give voice to the experts in the field and to stay up to date on research, policy, and responses to disinformation. Our webinar today will be focused precisely on the latter. Our guest speaker is Sviatoslav Hnizdovskyi, founder and executive director of OpenMinds. And I have to say that this session, titled New Approaches to Measuring the Impact of Counter-Disinformation Campaigns, has sparked a lot of interest given the number of pre-registrations. But before delving into the topic and introducing our guest speaker properly, let me mention a few housekeeping rules that may already sound familiar to many of you. First, this session is being recorded and the playback will be available shortly on our YouTube channel. Second, for communication purposes and for the Q&A session, we will use Slido. You can open the app on your phone by scanning the QR code you currently see on the screen, or type in slido.com in your web browser, and when requested, adding the hashtag disinfo. Please don't use the chat on Zoom because your questions can be overlooked. Let's get some audience interaction by inviting you to answer 2 questions. As usual, please tell us where are you joining us from today and which sector you represent. Quick reminder for the latecomers, slido.com hashtag disinfo. I'll give you a minute. And in the meantime, let me remind you that EU DisinfoLab has opened the call for proposals for our annual conference to be held in Ljubljana in Slovenia on the 15th and 16th of October. We are accepting proposals for presentations until the 21st of February. So don't miss this opportunity. Let's have a look at the audience right now. Many people from Europe, Brussels, Paris, London, but also from the other side of the Atlantic, United States, and from Asia as well. Singapore, okay, many European cities. That's right, many countries and cities represented here. And regarding the sector, let's see the answers. Nobody answering this question. Oh, a big representation from the academia, non-government organizations in the second place, business as well, private companies, diplomatic services, well represented as well, media, and other. Great. And now that you are familiar with Slido, don't wait until the end to submit your questions, please. You can send them whenever you like during the presentation, and we will do our best to address them all during the Q&A session. Having explained the context and the housekeeping rules, it's time to frame the topic. One of the most challenging and intriguing issues in our community is how to respond to disinformation campaigns and how to develop and implement effective processes. This makes part of which EU DisinfoLab focuses on. So we are happy to learn about new approaches to address this challenge. And today, our speaker brings us a proposal focused on the mechanisms and frameworks to measuring the impact of counter-disinformation endeavors. Drawing on recent studies from social and behavioral science, as well as insights from his hands-on experience, he will explore how narratives influence both individual and societal sentiments and drive real behavioral change. I am pleased to introduce Sviatoslav Hnizdovskyi. He is a former research fellow at Harvard University, an expert in applied behavioral science, and a tech entrepreneur. He is the founder and executive director of OpenMinds, a company offering solutions in the counter-disinformation field to governments, including Ukraine and NATO member states. and which has been recognized for its investigations into Russian disinformation and information warfare. And without further delay, let's welcome Sviatoslav. Thank you for accepting our invitation and looking forward to listening to your presentation. Over to you.
Thank you, Raquel, for setting the stage and highlighting the importance of this topic. It's so nice to see over 100 people already here. So I imagine if you were in a physical space, this would be quite a busy room for now. So in a nutshell, today I'd like to speak about the learnings primarily. Myself and our team learned from Ukraine, from the context of Russia-Ukrainian hybrid cognitive warfare, and share with you a few specific case studies, but also the developed framework that we use at OpenMinds as a result of our work. I'll start sharing my screen and showing you some materials and charts. So I'll start with this figure, and as I know, many people in this audience are coming from academia, so probably some of you know what that represents, but it's the budget that, with the very modest estimations, it's, I think, according to debunk.org, Russia spends annually on foreign propaganda, foreign influence. There are many great investigations in the last 2-3 years highlighting how specifically they work, what tools they use, what methods. And it feels that the democratic world is slowly starting to realize that we are in the midst of the cognitive arms race, cognitive warfare arms race. We are also lagging behind significantly. The estimates for China, by the way, I tried to find the figure. There are no good sources, but there are estimates that you can at least multiply it by 5 or 10, which is again something we could only speculate about. But the problem with this figure is that we don't know necessarily how much of that is spent through the conventional media like RT and Sputnik, and through social media, troll farms, Fimi attack. But we should place the topic of dis and misinformation in the broadest spectrum of propaganda, which has more specific strategic objectives. It's not just about a single narrative, a single piece of factual information, and the broader, even broader topic of cognitive warfare here. And let's start with just mapping the landscape, the environment. So when we speak about propaganda, we think about CAB, we think about coordinated inauthentic behavior. We are thinking about FEMI, we are thinking about troll farms, narratives, election interference, all these things. And as it comes to counter propaganda, counter disinformation, we have our sort of usual tools that, of course, widely used across the EU and other democratic world countries, including debunking, media monitoring, investigations, looking into narratives, looking into network analysis, and media literacy programs. So that's the current kind of landscape as we understand it. When the full-scale invasion started in Ukraine in 2022, it was obvious that this paradigm with this more conventional understanding of the informational landscape and disinformation propaganda is probably not really representative enough and not exhaustive. And I suggest we start thinking also about another dimension. So add just one more dimension to this landscape. So everything to the left I've just covered is the supply or push side of propaganda. Basically either malign actor trying to influence, push something onto the audience through troll farms, through Fimi attack, or defense side, right? In the face of government institutions, NGOs try to push some sort of protection mechanisms, again, with the final recipient of the general population of specific audience. But there is also this demand, big pull side of propaganda. And this is basically the perennial need for a narrative order. This is something that people just really feel now as the result of the meaning crisis that is developed, as the result of the alienation from their communities, a lot of trust in institutions and other things. And propaganda really flourishes and thrives on this gap, on this void of the absence of the narrative order that was always there throughout our history. So we had the narrative order till 19th century mostly as the religious framework, right? So people basically had this answer. And in 20th century, we had the very impactful presence of ideologies, at least in Europe, right, that provided people with a narrative order, and later liberalism as the last ideology that prevailed over fascism and communism, for example. But the question is, what could be this demand and pull side of counter-propaganda? And that was the most important question I personally was thinking about for the last 3 years, and we were trying to investigate with our team. And probably the easiest way to think about that, if you think about the final audiences, is that it doesn't matter whether you conduct propaganda campaign or counter-propaganda strategic communication messaging, you're appealing to these very, very existential needs for order, safety, community belonging, and creating the overarching narrative. So, for example, when the full-scale invasion of Russia into Ukraine started, Ukrainians were actually quite well protected from the malign influence of Russian propaganda at that stage, because there was this overarching narrative that we are entering this existential warfare for survival, and we have to stand strong and execute the best of our skills and basically survive. And Ukraine was never that resilient before. If you remember, like all the time from the collapse of Soviet Union till basically the revolution of dignity in 2014, it was always torn apart by Russian propaganda, by the networks of media and TV stations controlled by Russian actors. So that's an example how the change, the shift within the narrative order actually created a lot of resilience. I wish there was this also resilient further west when we speak about Europe, and it feels there is some now emerging sentiment about the global threat coming from, again, Russia and China potentially as well. But there is still this gap, yes, and still the, I would say, yeah, still the feeling of alienation in a way that's present. And there are many works I could refer here to. Probably the best one would be the professor of the cognitive science at the University of Toronto, John Vervaeke, and his recent book, Awakening from the Meaning Crisis, that explains this line of argument quite well. So that's just to sum up. Basically, people themselves would readily consume propaganda, would readily consume disinformation, as they actively seek for the narratives. And again, this is just the mechanisms how to shift from chaos to order, how to get a sense of security, and how to have this sense of belonging to the community. Now I'd like to probably just reflect on this big part of the work that majority of us here are doing. Majority of our institutions and majority of our budgets are spent on the different types of the supply push side of counter disinformation, counter propaganda, including, again, media literacy, investigations of networks, debunking campaigns, etc. And I'll try to make an argument where we can have and still facing big vulnerability in this counter propaganda dimension of the supply side. The first chart that I'd like to present is about the reduction of cost it takes to launch any malign campaign, coordinated campaign, So we still all remember like the active measures era, that like Soviet Union basically famously used the active measures against the West through different networks of newspapers, movies, other things. And the cost of production and cost of dissemination, basically the two main parameters I'll be talking about now, were quite high. So, I mean, to produce a movie, to write a book, you need to spend a lot of resources. It takes time, it takes many months and years. And then once you have it, you also have to disseminate it somehow to basically make people read it, which wasn't an easy thing to do. So then with an advent of internet and decentralized networks distribution, you start seeing the drop of cost of campaign dissemination. Basically, there are forums, there are chats, there are websites, so people start disseminating information more freely, and the cost of that drops. And another big cornerstone and milestone where the cost of campaign dissemination dropped significantly was the advent of mobile and social media. So basically now you can use the algorithmic feeds, you can promote your content in a way through the paid ad, you can do that through the potentially coordinated and authentic behavior as well, something we started facing in the middle of 2010. And the cost of campaign dissemination continued to drop. Now let's take a look at the cost of content production. So I would argue it remains pretty much high and constant up till the very recent Gen AI advent. So it still took a lot of time, even in 2017, 18, 2020, to think about like a campaign, to create a movie, to create a, to edit a video, to think about different messages. We also, for example, could take a look at how the biggest troll farms worked in Orgino, yes, controlled by people affiliated to Prigozhin and Wagner Group. And we could see that it actually still took them a lot of time and resources to scale the production. So they basically had to hire new people every month to continue scaling. But with the advent of Gen AI, now we are seeing for the first time probably the huge drop of the cost of content production. So instead of employing a few thousand trolls, you can just simply produce unique pieces of content that would be aligned with a single narrative extremely affordably, and then disseminate it in the same way. So basically, seeing these both reductions of cost rings a bell about the vulnerability we are living through. There are some good estimates, but we could say there was very significant up to 1000x reduction of cost production and dissemination in the last 10, 15 years. And the problem with the supply push side of counter-disinformation is it becomes really impossible to not just react, but even to detect all of that. So the campaigns are spreading, the narratives are spreading. We are facing difficulties in having social media, for example, platforms constrain these activities. We are seeing what is happening now with the Facebook fact-checking instruments. We are seeing what is happening with the Twitter/X, and it becomes a very asymmetric situation for the democratic world, where it becomes quite impossible to really debunk, even pre-bunk, and monitor all of these activities. It's also quite impossible to measure harm, because imagine we completely perfectly measured each and single coordinated and authentic behavior campaign. Imagine we have like a super pooper dashboard that shows us all of the campaigns, all of the networks. So the second question we could ask, okay, and how much harm it actually each of them did, because we don't have resources to deal with all of these thousands of campaigns. If we were just to focus on 5 or 10 of them, how do we prioritize it? And we don't have an answer for that, unfortunately. And the same for the measurements of effectiveness of counter-disinformation activities, of counter-disinformation
It's similar in a way that we can't really figure out what measurements we have to do here. So these were the challenges we faced and our team faced when we worked in the domain of cognitive warfare in Ukraine in the last 3 years. And the metaphor here is basically, we are in the middle of the big boxing match. There is an adversary that is punching and pushing and is extremely fast and outrageous. And we as a democratic world are trying to just dodge and parry the punches, but we are never punching back. So this is probably what's happening now. And the question was, okay, how could we make any breakthrough into this landscape? Is there anything new we could suggest? Because we don't have this legacy of the very standardized procedures. We were not the part of NATO frameworks or EU frameworks in Ukraine, so we had to reinvent many things from scratch, and also we had to think of the new ways how we could do the measurements and also think about this counter-influence. Just a few brief facts about OpenMinds and why I think I could just a little bit speak about this topic. We conducted around 55 investigations on Russian propaganda in the last 3 years, but also we launched counter-disinformation interventions and campaigns, and mostly in temporary occupied territories of Ukraine, basically communicating to our own audience, to Ukrainian audience that are being now held under occupation. And we tried to estimate that we had a total of close to 1.9 billion interactions with the target audience in the last 3 years as well. So basically the framework and majority of my findings I'm about to present are based on this empirical knowledge and experience. There are a couple of the reports. So we're also looking at the Russian electoral interference. We are looking at the domestic propaganda. So if you're interested in that, you can visit our websites to read more about these topics as well. Okay, so here is a big map where I tried to just put all the major stages our team is going through when we are launching any counter-disinformation initiative and campaign. So it might look a bit overwhelming initially, but I will briefly go through that, and I'll give you specific examples for each and every point here, and hope you will have an understanding of how that works. So, I mean, it's quite typical to divide this into 3 stages. You have research stage, you have communication stage, and you have measurements of effectiveness stage. And I'll have to cover all 3 of them because they are, of course, quite interrelated. So for the research stage, we would usually rely on 3 main methods of analysis. So doing some sort of triangulation exercise. So usually we would start with the big data analysis, typical social media trends, narratives, sentiments, search queries, for example. So how the information landscape already looks like. Second, we would add to this mix the polling, where we would segment the audiences, we would identify, let's say, key attitudes, concerns, basically just to better understand the things that people don't talk about online, but could tell you when you ask the question. And on top of that, the qualitative research, basically in-depth interviews, trying to dive deeper into the specific motivations. And for the sake of simplicity of this showcase, I'll share with you a specific goal we tried to achieve. We understand that Russian propaganda works in temporary occupied territories of Ukraine to actually persuade Ukrainians to engage in an active war against their Ukrainian compatriots on the other side of the fence. So basically, forcing people through propaganda and through influence into the trenches. And we were trying to figure out how this specifically works, what they are using as an instrument of influence, and how we could do counter-influence, counter-disinformation campaigning. And there is one more method here. It's the wisdom of the crowd, which we would use, for example, to help us understand what could be the counter narrative. So once we measured the existing narratives through the item number 1, big data analysis of social media, we would ask the range of experts, 30, 40 people usually, what would you think is the best counter narrative for this narrative? Let's say what kind of evidence we should provide people with to make them more critical, more resilient, more willing to question the official position of the Russian government or on the temporary occupied territories. So we started with these measurements of contract service promotion, and we figured out there was a big increase of the ads on different social media platforms that Russian government promoted and tried. That's how they were trying to also motivate people and find some incentives to force them into trenches. And we could see more than 115x growth of these searches for contract service between 2022 and 2024. So that shows the demand, the demand side of propaganda. Basically, there is push from the government and there is an interest, there is a demand for that. There is also increased search. And of course, the relation is not fully causal here. So some of these interests could be explained by just the deteriorating conditions maybe, or some other things. So it wasn't the question of our research, the question was just merely mapping the landscape. Then we, of course, measured the sentiments, the comments below these ads. We measured how specifically they were disseminated, and we estimated that nearly 77% of positive messages and comments around these conscription promotion ads were most likely posted by bot accounts. So for this, I think we used bot.com.zor and a few other proprietary methods for bot detection. We could also see an interesting pattern where, for example, people would just comment between 9 and 5 Monday to Friday. That's just, and having this skewed distribution would actually be also a good representation of the coordinated behavior. But I'll not focus on that much. That's again just briefly running through the whole process here. We also tried to look at specific narratives and motivations. So what topics the government promotes when they are speaking about the service. And interestingly, they mostly spoke about the financial incentive, salaries, benefits, and not that much about, the homeland security, the existential war against NATO. So that was something that surprised us quite a lot. So we mapped the landscape. We consulted we did this wisdom of the crowd exercise to gather some ideas for counter narratives. And we actually had to build some communication channels. How would we communicate to people in Donetsk, Crimea, newly occupied territories? Because we can't just simply go and launch Facebook ads. It's not possible. It's sanctioned. We can't do the Google ads or any other means of dissemination. These platforms just don't simply work on TOT. And TikTok, for example, is not an option as well, because it assumes that Ukrainian temporary occupied territories are the parts of Russia, and the algorithm behaves as if it was in Russia. So we faced these difficulties, and we had to build some mechanisms from scratch around the automated messages on Telegram and some other platforms, how we would disseminate these counter narratives and how we would, for example, find the instance of the manipulation. And similar to what Twitter community nodes does, we would basically send our account automatically, figure out what's the instance of manipulation and drop some sort of community nodes. But there are no community nodes on Telegram, so we sort of had to do that manually. The question was what kind of counter narratives we could disseminate, and the process how we came up with the list was through the randomized controlled trials methodology, where basically we would randomly divide the participants of experiments. We had an access to the population there and could conduct these psychological experiments. Then we would present each and every group with a narrative that is debunking or that is just presenting a different, more evidence-based version of these conscription ads. And we would have a control group that is presented with very neutral, like, article about some entertainment topic. And then we would start measuring things like, what's the readiness to fight in the special military operation? What is the perception of the validity of official government position? How likely is someone to speak about the problems with the special military operations within their community, and measuring this difference in the results? So that's basically how we did this causality check. So instead of just conducting campaign and measuring the pre-campaign and post-campaign effect on something, we split the audiences, so we knew exactly that it was our counter-narrative, our counter-disinformation initiative that decreased the particular attitude or potentially even behavior intent. So I'll show you in a moment what I mean by behavior intent. And it was that specifically, not something else. It can't be explained by some other factor. So when we measure the effectiveness, we usually think about things like engagements, likes, how many people read the counter-disinformation, I don't know, debunking or debunking story, how many people shared. But there are more layers to that, right? So you can go on the layer of the attitude shift, like do people become more resilient in a way, at least expressing resilience as their attitude? Are they supporting now the special military operation less when it comes to temporary occupied territories of Ukraine? But also the questions about behaviors. So we can't really measure behaviors. That's very tricky. But we could do the exercise of the behavior intent measurement. For example, asking people that we would donate the 30% of the reward for this study to the particular organization, and we of course never donated to the organizations we listed. There was a specific description of that afterwards, so within the ethical framework of the research design. But that was just a way for us how we could measure something beyond attitudes and beyond just opinion answers. So this was a big process. It took some time, but more importantly, it didn't take significant financial resources to do that. Because sometimes you would just jump straight away to the content communication campaign and not measure this impact of the narrative on the attitudes, and then face the big problem that campaign, for example, had some second order effects or backfiring effects, actually not serving the purpose. A good example of that would be when the full-scale invasion started. The Ukrainian government actually promoted this distribution of the bodies of the dead Russian soldiers into Russian social media. So they basically asked all of the Ukrainian volunteers to take these pictures and go and post it on Kontakte and Telegram and scare Russians and show them how bad is the war and what's going on here. But we then later measured how that worked. And unfortunately, this was a huge backfiring campaign because it created even more hatred towards Ukraine, towards NATO, and potentially it made the situation much more worse for us. So that's an example how the things could go wrong if you don't measure this within the experimental environment first and see the real impact on the key metrics. So then we are moving to the launching the full-scale counter-influence campaign and measuring it. So basically, very briefly here, the same thing we did in the experimental environment, we then shifted and did an A/B test, what's called in the digital marketing world, on the broader audience. So basically, also having some control message and having the experimental message and tracking the desired behavior. For example, clicks on a particular guide, how to avoid legally conscription, or measure the interest in getting more information about the topic. So some specific behavior intents as well, or proxies for real behavior. Of course, we can't measure whether people eventually ended up in the trenches, unfortunately, but we could measure at least these proxies, which is good enough. And yeah, these are a couple of examples how we did that through phone calling or through Telegram messages, again, using these proprietary methods of dissemination. And at the end of the day, what was important to see is how our narratives actually increase this willingness to perceive information more critically, to not trust the official government propaganda, to look through some alternative information, to figure out more legal ways how they can avoid conscription if they don't want to fight against their fellow Ukrainians in the TOT. And the best, unfortunately, I cannot reveal the specific narrative because this was the work done together with the Ukrainian government partially, and this is the information that creates some strategic advantage. So, but basically the effect of narrative was almost more than double increase in seeking additional information. That is one of the metrics as an example. The next stage is basically measuring the sustainability of effect. Okay, so imagine we decreased some attitude and behavior in a particular moment of time by a lot, by 50%. But the question whether this sticks, right? What happens a few weeks and months after the campaign? And that's where we used a longitude design of opinion polls, but also longitudinal sentiment and narratives measurement through social media platforms. Separating the audience we conducted communication to. So basically we knew their parameters, like sometimes we would randomize small cities and towns, sometimes some other demographic parameters, and measuring these audiences versus the control audiences, which we didn't communicate to, and measuring their activity online, comments, how they express themselves about the war, propaganda later on, and measuring this, again, sustainability of effect. That was a very important thing to do. So coming back again, one more time, this big map. So we did initially these three, sometimes we wouldn't do all three, sometimes one or two methods is enough, but basically we want to have some triangulation. We moved to the causal measurement of the narrative impact, first in the experimental environment, something that is extremely cost affordable and easy to do. Then we would move to the campaign launch, but still doing the real world A/B testing to further test the narrative impact. And then once we have the full confidence, we shifted to full scale strategic communication campaign. And then we did this post measurement, which I've just explained, checking the different metrics, not just engagements, likes, and shares, but going one layer deeper to check the impact on attitudes and behavior intents, and even one layer deeper to check the sustainability of the change as well. Here is a brief map of this post-campaign measurement. So very briefly, we had these four types of, four categories of activities. Product, which is like a specific, message, a specific piece of evidence, investigation that we dropped somewhere. Campaign is the broader collection of a few products like that. broader narrative is the narrative that we tested that combines many campaigns and creates a single line of narrative. And then program is basically a big line of effort that has many narratives within it. And then in the columns here, you have 4 or 5 types of depth of measurement. So exposure is something all of you familiar with. Majority of campaigns are measured using the impressions, views, interactions. Then you have public engagement, like, okay, was it received well? How many people liked it, shared, clicked on it? Then we added this interesting layer of measurement, engagement of authorities. So it was applicable to Ukrainian occupied territories because there are some local Russian authorities that when they saw our counter-influence communication and debunking of the propaganda they conducted locally, they started actually calling us out. They started saying that there is some sort of communication going on, that these are fakes, without even understanding like the nature of that. So this is also something we measured because it signifies that they care about this specific narrative and topic, and that's important on the strategic level for Ukraine to understand what the adversary is the most obsessed about. And then we move to this last two: effectiveness, again, attitude behavior change, randomized controlled trials that helps us to establish causality, and then sustainability, which I've explained. So this is briefly the map we have. I'd like to finish with a few takeaways. Basically, I propose today how we could look at disinformation and countering disinformation, adding one more dimension. So not just from the push and supply side, but also from the demand side, why there is this perennial need for the narrative order and how it's satisfied, how, let's say, conspiracy theory satisfied that, and propaganda uses often conspiracy. But what we could do alternatively to also speak to people on this level of the narrative order. And then I shifted the presentation to basically suggest that narratives are not our enemies, and it's not just something we have to measure and counter, but sometimes use proactively narratives to create the narrative order we want based on factual, truthful information, of course. And thirdly is that the measurements of narratives should be are the most effective when we are using causal mechanisms. Again, randomizing audiences, measuring the causal impact. Sorry, I made a small mistake here. And also measuring the sustainability of change. So it's not just about typical social media monitoring where we have a narrative and that's it. It's the question of how much harm and how much attitude and behavior change each narrative drives, whether it's adversary narrative or our narrative. And this is a quite mirroring situation here. Thank you for your attention. And already saw there are some questions. And I would be happy to reveal more. I could speak hours about that probably. So if you're interested, please feel free to reach out on LinkedIn, visit our website. There are many public investigations and reports published, or reach out via email. And Raquel and the teams, thank you for the opportunity to present to the audience today.
Thank you so much, Sviat, for sharing with us this very, very insightful methodology and for offering food for thoughts and also for discussions, especially regarding the importance of acting on the demand side, not just in the supply side of disinformation and propaganda campaigns. That is where most of the researchers and the community are focused on. Now it's time to start the Q&A session. As a reminder, please use the QR code to join Slido or type slido.com and hashtag disinfo. We have around 15 minutes for questions. And at this moment, we are more than 100 and 30 people in the room. That's great. So we have already plenty of questions on Slido. Please vote for the ones you would like to be answered, so we can get an idea of which ones are more relevant to you, and so we can address them first. Okay, here maybe we can start with the $1 million question, Sviat. What would a good counter-disinformation policy strategy look like that Western governments should adopt?
Well, that is a very complex question, and I'm not a policymaker. I'm just a practitioner. So I think it's a paradigm shift we need. It's basically this realization that disinformation is just a part of a broader cognitive warfare. It's an arms race. Adversaries are using all of the available tactics and methods, exposing all of the vulnerabilities of democratic order, exposing all of the vulnerabilities of social media frameworks, of algorithmic feed, for example, of polarization that they can cause through that. And I think just broadening the range of the mechanisms we use to respond. So going beyond typical, media literacy, debunking, pre-bunking, and thinking what is the broader scope of mechanisms we could use. I think the biggest challenge here is also stay within the ethical framework. So we don't necessarily, while doing that, we don't want to cross any ethical boundaries, and that's important. And that's what we follow in our work as well. But that's a big challenge, because as soon as you start, learning from your adversary, taking some tactics from them, it's a shaky ground. So it's a weapon in itself, right? It's a very similar situation to what we faced in the 1940s, where we had Project Los Alamos, we had Manhattan Project, basically, and Oppenheimer's team working on the nuclear weapon, and we had the team in the Soviet Union, and potentially, we also knew that Nazis were working on the nukes. So and what we created is now a big deterrence mechanism. It works so far. It's been 70 years, 80 years. But I'm not sure whether the world would be a better place if we didn't have this deterrence mechanism. So again, maybe we could see countering disinformation, Western policy and strategy as this sort of deterrence mechanism as well. Maybe just signaling to countries like Russia that we can also fight back and we can cause a lot of trouble for you internally, because we have this knowledge and tools and we know the methods. Maybe that itself, this sort of meta message to them might signal the strength and might actually create the deterrence in a way. So this is my opinion as of now.
I think you already answered two related questions, one related to the effectiveness of the debunking and fact-checking approach, and the other one related to the deterrence effect on the threat actors. So let's move to the next one. I like this one, that it's quite controversial. How can we ensure that measuring the impact of these campaigns doesn't inadvertently distort public opinion or contribute to further polarization?
This is a great question, because basically the measuring as an intervention is already the disturbance to the system, right? So even if you just want to measure, let's say, hostile narratives, I think what's important is to properly organize this design of the experiment and study to actually somehow try to mitigate these risks. That's when we measure, let's say, the hostile narratives and want to understand how much harm they cause. So we could, we could basically gather 500 people in Brussels, show them different Russian narratives, have a control group, and measure different metrics after they read the narrative, and see how reading this narrative actually impacted, let's say, the trust in the EU or trust in the integrity of the European, policy, whatever. But that's a big thing. I'm not sure anyone has a good answer to that. When it comes to the opposite, when it comes to measuring the counter narratives, I think we're here more on the safer side, because the counter narratives we usually create are already hopefully something that we believe is less harmful or is not harmful at all. Again, as an example, with this Ukrainian volunteering campaign to disseminate the pictures of the dead Russian troops and their bodies, sometimes things could go wrong. So, but that's why it's still better to do this in the controlled experimental environment on a very small, population, basically on a very small segment of the audience, like 1,000 people, 2,000 people, instead of just going blindly to launch full-scale campaigns, pouring millions of dollars to that and many efforts, and later realizing how much harm it did. So basically, doing that in iterations, it's a self-mitigation mechanism, I believe.
Thank you,
Pablo.
Sviat.
This is a great question.
Yeah, I agree. Let's move to the other one that it's voted by many people. What use does social media monitoring still have in an asymmetrical environment? Should we just stop it?
Yes, okay. It's a complex one. I think the current state of technology, I've seen and worked with many products that are doing social media monitoring, threat intelligence, they use many different words, is basically, in the best case scenario, they show us that there was some coordination, network, and narrative. But I already addressed that partially in my presentation, that it's not clear how we proceed with that. So usually it ends up with a report on the website of NATO Stratcom, a similar institution, saying, yes, we figured out there was a network, but we still, can't prioritize these different critical vulnerabilities. Okay, so, I mean, we could probably now look at one of these tools and find hundreds of narratives that are coordinated and malign. And we don't know which of them is more harmful. So that's the first gap. And the second gap is you don't have much leverage, unfortunately, over social media platforms to say, could you please remove completely these accounts? Could you please do some sort of fact checking? And we see actually the reverse tendency, at least with the new administration now. So basically, they're seeing disinformation as something that is opposite to the free speech, and hence any sort of regulations on social media and content moderation as the same thing that threatens the free speech. So I think we are moving to the very different world. I think many of these tools will have to adapt if they want to deliver some value. But I think it's potentially, again, something that we just it's a nice thing to show and a few fancy charts, but it doesn't answer the question, so what? I mean, that's it. So as a research tool, fabulous. As something practical, I think we still have to do a lot of thinking and working how to make it viable.
Totally agree, Sviat. Next question coming from Elisa Bruckner. How important is it for governments to statistically track hybrid threats such as cyber attacks, disinformation campaigns, etc.?
I think the answer is a bit obvious, but I mean, how important related to what? So it's always a question of priorities, right? So everyone is, of course, obsessed with the kinetic warfare threats. That's something that on the surface looks and sounds terrible. And I mean, it's very easy to imagine what could that look like. We don't even have to imagine. We can just look at Ukraine. We can look at some other places in the world over the last 15, 20 years. But then if you ask the question, what were the preconditions for all of the current kinetic or majority of current kinetic conflicts? It was actually hybrid warfare and hybrid threats. So Russia, before entering into Ukraine and doing the full-scale invasion, they made sure that the West is divided, it's polarized, it's a bit, it's weaker than it was in, you know, the 90s, for example, or early 2000s. It's hesitant to respond. And I think they did a great job. And we just, I mean, have to really now properly reflect on that and see the hybrid war as the step that could very easily lead to the kinetic war. So I think there should be more attention, more budgets, more institutions, better collaboration in this domain, because the ministries of defense of the countries have to become the ministries of cyber and hybrid defense in a way. So it's not just about tanks and drones, but it's also about many other things. So
yeah, and Sviatoslav, you focused your research and your use cases in the Ukrainian war, but someone is asking in the chat if do you think the same strategies can be applied for other types of disinformation, for example, health disinformation like anti-vaccines or anti-abortion narratives?
Definitely. I think, again, with the empirical evidence, we try to create some sort of standardized checklist, process, best practices. And we already try to apply that in some other regions, let's call it. I think it could be applied with some changes and tweaks probably to something non-war related, but disinformation in the healthcare or energetic sector, for example, as well. It causes a big problem, yeah, for sure. And the core of the framework is, again, the causality measurement is something that you can say with a great degree of confidence. Yeah, actually, it's this narrative that impacts the attitude or behaviors by that much. And this is the most important answer we need. It's basically also answering how much does it cost Russia for $1 million to increase by how much, whatever the measurement is, polarization in Europe. Because once we coin that question, we could start measuring many things like that. So this is a shift of the paradigm that is needed, I believe.
There is another question I would like to push regarding the application of the methodology. Do you think that threat actors can use a similar approach to test the effectiveness of their disinformation campaigns? I actually wanted to ask you something similar. I mean, can this methodology be used to measure the impact of disinformation narratives as well and check if some behavioral changes were driven by disinformation or foreign influence campaigns?
Yes, again, it's a mirror. And what I presented as a methodology is not something we came up with. It already exists for many decades in the world of digital marketing, in the world of advertisement. So, as you know, many inventions are happening either in the military, like, GPS, internet, but also, in this case, we are actually trying to bring the commercial standardized practices. And RCT is like, in medicine, for example, it's one of the most important methods, experimental methods, to bring that to the defense domain. So, and to strengthen it. So yeah, for sure. And based on what we know about their activities, at least in Russia, we know that they are using some of these methodologies, that they have access to much more data than we could imagine. And as I told you, probably they already 10, 15 years, more on a more advanced stage of their kind of understanding and willingness to invest into this domain of warfare. And we are lagging behind, and we have to close this gap, I think, as soon as possible.
Sviatoslav, I would like to continue this conversation, but unfortunately, we don't have any more time. Thank you again for these exciting discussions that highlighted how important is to find the most suitable responses to each disinformation campaign and to act as well on the demand side, not just in the supply side, as we have been mentioning. And I hope our audience has enjoyed and learned a lot. And that is why you'll be kindly requested to fill in a rating survey after the webinar ends. I remind that you can also suggest future topics to be covered in our sessions. And before wrapping up, let me announce our next webinars. On the 20th of February, we will host Cleaning the Air, Building Trust Against Climate Misinformation Storm with Jody Molyneux from Resolver. And on the 6th of March, we will have Melodies of Malice, understanding how AI fuels the creation and spread of extremist music with Heron Lopez. We hope to keep seeing you around, and also a quick reminder that the recording of this webinar will be available shortly on our YouTube channel. Thanks again, Sviat. Thanks to Maria, our support behind the scenes, and thanks to everyone who attended. Have a lovely rest of the day and see you very soon.
Thank you.